Okay, I am going to walk you through the trimming of the Zoe Quilt Pattern. Now this is the baby size, and it will be almost exactly the same for all sizes. Obviously the other ones are bigger, but I'm going to show you on this size so you get the idea. This pattern is really easy, so trimming is the hardest part, but it is not that bad. The only difference between trimming the baby size and the other sizes are that the baby size is symmetrical going down the middle and the other two aren't. So on the baby size, 2 of the corners are already square, and on the other ones only 1 of the corners is, but otherwise same thing. So if you are nervous, my kids are very loud in the background. If you are nervous about trimming your quilt, I would say before you trim, take something stuck to it. Take your ruler and using a pen, just mark where you're going to quilt around the whole thing first, because then it's just a little less scary than actually cutting. So I'm going to use 2 things. One is a square ruler. And I like to use the biggest square ruler I have, which is, I have this Creative Grid 16.5-inch ruler. But for a long time I use a 12.5-inch, that's fine. If you don't have anything bigger, that's fine too. So what I'm gonna do is line up, and you can see I already did do some trimming on my quilt before I quilted it. I don't like to trim my quilt top all the way until I'm done quilting, because I'm always going to trim after I quilt anyway. You can see here that it's not trimmed all the way. So I just did a really rough trim, and I gave myself about 1 inch of extra room around the whole thing before I basted it. If you are taking a quilt to a long arm quilter, you probably want to completely trim it first, but I'm not. So obviously I didn't. I've already quilted mine. I'm going to grab a smaller ruler just so I can give you one thing you can try if you're nervous is if I put this in the corner over here, you can't see on the right side, but I have it lined up with the edges. You can see that even though I have a really big ruler, it doesn't reach all the way here. So I want to use this edge of the quilt, which is the top center, as a guide. So I'm going to take this other ruler and put it right up next to my other ruler, so I can see where I'm going to want to trim in this direction. I'm going to scoot it over so you can see a little better. But I'm going to keep that lined up. And then over here, you can see there are places where the seam ends. Right here, it's the only place you can see at the moment, or up here too, here. And I'm going to use that as a guide and make sure that I at least trim those off, and I'm going to line up the edge of it over here. And once I have it lined up, you can see I didn't trim it very squarely when I did my rough trim before quilting, which is fine because I don't need it to be square at that point. So I've got this lined up over here on the side that you can't see, and I've got this lined up here. And I always want to make sure that my quilt is laying really flat on my surface. And I'm going to trim the corner. Just like that. So now I'm going to move on to the next corner. This would be if you're looking at the diagram in the pattern, this is the top left corner. And I'm going to have the same, I'm still using this as a guide. This is the top center of the quilt. And I'm now also, you can see I have these places right here where the seams end. And I'm going to use that as those 3 things. And I have one you can't see here, over here too, that I'm going to use. That's the advantage of having a large ruler. And if you don't, you can always just take as many rulers as you have and line them up next to each other. That works really well. So I'm lining up all my different places. This is just like when you're in math class and you're graphing. The more points you have, you know, you need to have at least a certain number of points, but the more points you have on your graph, the easier it is to see what your shape is. So the more places you can get to line up when you're trimming your quilt top, the more accurate your trimming will be. So I've just trimmed this corner. Now I'm doing the bottom left corner, and these two will be easier since they already have a a square edge. But they may, you know, with quilting things shift a little bit, and most likely I'm going to trim a little bit off of that side because it's slightly oversized for what it needs to be. I'm using this ruler again over here to give me some more points to line up with, and then I'm going to use that again down here and make sure that I'm squaring things up. And another thing too is that you can kind of pay attention to. See, I have this diagonal line that goes down the middle here. It's kind of tricky to see, but I want it to look like it's going straight. It's perpendicular to these seams. And you can't really tell exactly, well, you can. One thing you can do is, like right here, I have the quarter line marks lined up along the edge of my ruler, quarter inch. I have the same, it's hitting the same spot along the ruler. And so I feel like that's a pretty good indication that this is lined up correctly. So I'm going to trim. Don't be in a rush to trim. Make sure you clean off your cutting table first. I'm really bad about doing that, but it just always goes better if you have a clean cutting table. So here's the last corner. You can see I used Franken batting on my quilt. That's batting tape. I used leftover batting strips for this, which I almost always do for a baby size quilt because it's easy to put that together. All right, I'm going to do the same thing over here, where first I'm going to make sure that I'm trimming off all that I need to. I don't know if you can see over here. I'm using this ruler right up against my square ruler to make sure that I'm cutting off this place where the seam ends. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom over here. The ruler's pretty close to that. And now that I have that done, I'm going to check and make sure that this seam line right here lines up with the same point along the whole ruler, which, move it down just a little bit. So I'm using that 1/4 inch mark again. So right here where it's 9 1/4 inches, it's just hitting the same diagonal line that moves across my ruler. That makes me feel like I'm in pretty good shape to trim this off. Okay, so now I'm done with my square ruler, so I'm going to put it away because it's giant. And now this is the other ruler I'm going to use. This is my ruler that I use most often, which is the Creative Grids 8.5 by 24.5 inch ruler. I use this about, I don't know, 80% of the time for everything. So now all I have to do is connect the places I just cut, and we will see how good of a job I did or did not do. I'm going to make sure everything's flat. And I'm going to hope that these line up really nicely. Making sure everything is, you can see I trimmed a little bit more here than I did up here, which is fine. So what I want to do is just trim that little bit extra off. And this is, I'm gonna check here too to make sure that my seams are kind of meeting at the same place across the whole thing, and they're not quite. Let me make sure this is pulled all the way up. Okay. So now I'm going to trim this off. And then I'm going to trim this extra, which is only like 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to make sure this is all the way flat, and then I'm going to line up the marks over here with the corner of my quilt top. Line this up here. And then I'm making my corner square. That looks pretty good. Trim that off. Okay, now I'm going to do this last side. Not the last side, the next side. We still have, this is only the second side. Okay, make sure everything is straight. And this one's a little better. Trim that off. Gravity will kind of pull the quilt down. I don't have like the most giant cutting table in the world, so I just like to make sure. I can tell I'm gonna have to trim some off this side. Make sure everything is okay. So I can tell that I'm gonna need to trim some off over here. So I'm checking my diagonal lines too. And I'm gonna pull this back up. And I'm gonna make sure, I'm gonna rely more on my diagonal line than I am gonna on my corner, since I used that corner to square it up before. So I'm gonna do this, and then I'm gonna go back and make sure that this is still square. Make sure your quilt doesn't get folded under. Okay. So see, now this isn't square, so I'm just gonna re-square it up. Need it a little bit. Okay, side number. Oh, this is the last side. Okay. And I understand this can be a little bit frustrating, but it gets easier the more you do it. And it's a little scary to cut your quilt, but it's not that bad. If you're nervous about doing this, just mark it first, and then you can make sure you feel good about everything before. I'm going to check my seams again here and use that as a guide. I'm going to need to trim a little bit off of here. Okay, now that I've trimmed the quilt, I'm going to make sure that it's pretty square. So to do that, it's going to be really hard to show. I'm just going to fold it in half. I'm going to meet the corners here. And then make sure that the corner meets on this side. And then I'm going to fold it into quarters. And just make sure that everything is square enough. I don't stress about it being perfectly square. You can see it's a little bit extra right here, but to me that's, if it's more than 1/4 inch, I'd probably try to fix it, but if it's not, I just don't want, like, if somebody folds the quilt later, for it to one side to feel much larger the other. So I'm gonna do it one more time and make sure. If I were just cleaning up, and I folded this quilt, would I notice that the sides are not exactly the same? No, they're pretty close. So it was a little trickier to do. Let's say I folded it and I ended up, it looked more like, let's say like this. I would know that I needed to go back and I would just start over, do the corners again, do the kind of a ragged edge there, do the sides again, and then test it again. And it's less scary the more you do it. I just had like a ragged piece of fabric. So there it is, Zoe Quilt trimming.